Now let's finally come back to the Order Manager class that we briefly described earlier in this series of videos. Recall that the key method in the Order Manager class is the Place Order method. The Place Order method takes all the information needed to construct a customer record, plus it takes a shopping cart object. Recall also that the transaction annotation ensures that this method will be processed atomically as an all-or-nothing transaction, where any failure at any step in the process will cause the database to be rolled back to its previous state. The Place Order method calls three local helper methods: AdCustomer, which adds a customer record to the database; AddOrder, which adds a customer order record to the database; and AddOrdered items, which adds one or more ordered product records to the database. If any kind of exception occurs, the setRollbackOnly method is invoked on the context variable. The context variable is a session context object that is declared as an instance variable. You can see here that the variable has an @resource annotation, which means it is a reference to a resource. And if I give you 5 seconds, can you tell me one of the effects of adding this annotation to this variable? 5 seconds starting from now. Okay, when you add this annotation to a resource, the container injects the resource into the class at runtime. So you won't see the context variable initialized anywhere in this class. Let's take a look at the private helper methods one at a time. The AdCustomer method is fairly straightforward. It constructs a new customer entity, and then it adds that entity to the persistence context. Now, we said in the last slide that the entity is added to the database, but that's an oversimplification. Now let's talk about what really happens. The variable EM is the entity manager. The entity manager is also declared as an instance variable. It has the annotation persistence context because that's what it manages. Like the session context, the entity manager is injected into the class by the container. The persist method tells the entity manager to add the entity to the persistence context. The persistence context is an intermediary state between the entity existing separately from the database and the entity existing as part of the database. When the entity is in the persistence context, the entity manager is responsible for keeping it synchronized with the database through the object relational mapping. When the entity is added to the persistence context, it is marked for entry into the database as part of the transaction that began with the invocation of the Place Order method. Unless the entity manager is instructed to add this entity to the database early, it will be added when the transaction is committed. The AddOrder method is similar to the AdCustomer method. First, a new customer order is created. The customer is added and the cart total is added. Then, a confirmation number is created and added to the order. And finally, the order entity is added to the persistence context. Finally, we have the AddOrdered items method. This method adds ordered product entities to the persistence context. Recall that the ordered product table in the database is a join table between the customer order table and the product table. It exists because the customer order and the product tables have a many-to-many relationship, which cannot be directly modeled in our relational database. The ordered product table uses a composite primary key that comprises the primary keys of both the customer order and the product tables. Because of this, the persistence provider created a separate entity class for the composite key called Ordered Product PK and embedded it into the ordered product entity. Okay, let's step through this code, but we'll temporarily ignore the first line of this method, the call to flush, and see how everything else works. In the loop, we iterate through each item in the shopping cart. The product ID is available to us because a shopping cart item has a handle to the product. To set up a primary key for an ordered product, we first create a new ordered product PK object, and then we set the two foreign keys, the order's ID, which we can get from the order object that has been passed in, and the product's ID, which we've already obtained. Once we have our primary key, we use it to create a new ordered product entity. The only field we need after that is the quantity. And finally, we add the entity to the persistence context. So there's an extra step in the creation of the primary key object, but the code is still similar to what we've done when creating our other records. Okay, now let's go back to that flush command at the beginning. It turns out that there is a problem with this code if you don't include the flush invocation. The problem occurs in the call to order.getID. Remember that when an entity is in the persistence context, it has not been added to the database yet. The ID field is the primary key for a customer order record. However, we set up our customer order table so that the primary key is automatically incremented and therefore automatically generated by the database when a new record is added. Since the customer order entity only exists in the persistence context and has not been added to the database yet, it does not have a primary key, and therefore the getID method call will return a null value. To solve this problem, we need to force the addition of the order entity to the database before we make this call. The flush method tells the entity manager to write everything in the persistence context to the database now. Note that writing entities to the database before the transaction is committed does not mean that the transaction can no longer be rolled back. It simply means that doing so will entail having to go back and remove those added records from the database if a problem arises. The final method in the order manager is the getOrderDetails method. As we've seen previously, this method is called by the controller servlet during the purchase action. It returns a map that contains information that will ultimately be used by the confirmation page if the transaction is successful. The controller servlet takes the information that this method passes back and sets up attributes in the request scope with the same names as the keys in the order map you see here. The method is fairly straightforward, so I'm not going to go into detail on what all the code does here.